Thank you for coming out this evening. My name is Steven Steigman. I work for KCUR Public Radio in Kansas City. I'm the senior producer for our program Up to Date with Steve Kraske. And no, I don't pretend to be Steve Kraske. Then again, he doesn't pretend to be me. I'm glad you're all here this evening. We've got a fantastic panel and some wonderful topics, no doubt, to discuss this evening. Let me explain the format. We have Holly Weatherford from the ACLU of Kansas will give us a brief overview of the 2014 legislative session. And then we'll hear some commentary and some issue analysis from our panel of academics and policy experts, also known as Inside Kansas, for their columns across Kansas. We'll then save about some time at the end for Q&A. Allow me to introduce Holly Weatherford, and after she speaks, I'll introduce our other fine panelists. Holly Weatherford joined the ACLU of Kansas as Advocacy Director in December 2009. Her work is focused on community and legislative advocacy, primarily in the areas of voting rights, reproductive freedom, immigrants' rights, LGBT rights, and religious freedom. Prior to joining the ACLU, Holly worked as a government affairs professional and attorney in Washington, D.C., and returned to Kansas to serve as the lobbyist for Planned Parenthood of Kansas and Mid-Missouri. Please join me in welcoming Holly Weatherford.
Thank you. I will be brief because we have this excellent panel, and so what I'll do is just quickly go over what some of the hot topics were in the Kansas legislature this session and sort of set the stage for where we could be headed in the 2015 legislative session. But I first wanted to give a quick refresher of what the Kansas legislature currently looks like. As many of you probably remember, we had a significant shift in both chambers following the 2012 elections. We lost the moderate force in the Senate, and we actually saw the House change somewhat. We saw a large group of libertarians enter the House, and we were able to retain some of the moderate seats in the House as well. So in the Kansas Senate, we have 32 Republicans and we have 8 Democrats. In the House, we have 93 Republicans and 32 Democrats. I think one of the important things to know before we get into this discussion is what influences the Kansas legislature. And one of the primary influences in the Kansas legislature is ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council. And quite a bit of what I'm going to reference here in the overview, some of the legislation, is model legislation that comes from ALEC. MainStream did some analysis about what kind of influence ALEC has in the Kansas legislature. And when you run and crunch all of these numbers, basically the most compelling number I think that they came up with is that 76% of the legislature is controlled by ALEC in the most influential positions in the legislature. So when you back out non-ALEC members, you back out the minority party, and you look at those influential positions, which are the leadership positions, the Senate President, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Vice President, the Speaker Pro Tem. You look at committee chairs, and you analyze if these people are ALEC members, and if they have a leadership position in ALEC, we're looking at 76%. It's pretty overwhelming. The Speaker of the House is on the National Board of Directors for ALEC, as well as the President of the Senate. That's Ray Merrick and Susan Wagle. We have some other influences in the Kansas legislature. One of the ALEC cohorts is Americans for Prosperity. They have a lot of influence in the legislature. They have a lot of presence in the legislature. We saw them a lot this session, especially on one of the bills that I'll reference later, dealing with the renewable energy portfolio standards. There's also the Kansas Policy Institute. Some of you, I think, might be familiar with the Kansas Policy Institute. They too have a lot of influence in the Kansas legislature. They're regularly testifying, offering solutions to committees for their solutions for various policy proposals in committees. They have a strong lobbying presence in the legislature and a lot of influence, especially with those 76% that I mentioned just a second ago. There's also the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. We know that the Kansas Chamber of Commerce had a lot to do with that shift that we saw in terms of the makeup of the Kansas Senate in 2012. They have a lot of influence with legislators. They carry the force of Kansas businesses behind, a lot of Kansas businesses behind them, and they also are very involved in the Kansas elections. So how did this session play out? The session was very interesting. I would say the legislators had a lot of time to play, if you will. They were sort of out to play every Friday, clicking refresh on their computers, waiting to see if the Kansas Supreme Court was going to issue their school finance ruling. And so in the meantime, while they were waiting for that, they did a lot of interesting things. Some of the legislation that was taken on and did not pass, which I would then count in the win column for us, or those that share the similar ideals of MainStream. One was a bill that basically legislated discrimination based on sexual orientation. And you might have heard it spun a number of ways, but to break it down for you, basically businesses and government employees could choose to not serve a person because they believe that they are in a same-sex relationship or a same-sex marriage. That bill passed overwhelmingly out of the House, 72 votes in favor of that bill, and then their world came tumbling down, and a day later the Senate President and Vice President called the bill discrimination and said it was dead on arrival in the Senate. Some of that was due to some of the businesses that came out in opposition to that bill, like Sprint, Cessna, AT&T of Kansas was the first. There were continued attempts to ban Common Core in Kansas. And we saw that last session, and it was back this session. There was a rally in the Capitol, all sorts of activity in the Capitol around banning Common Core. And that was once again defeated in 2014. One of the interesting things was that this session, we didn't see a whole lot of activity around restricting access to women's health, be it abortion care or contraception. Usually we see a huge bill that contains, a number of various restrictions. We've seen one every year for as long as I've been in the Kansas Capitol. But this year, it wasn't there. And I don't have any analysis or reasons why off the top of my head. There was a bill that was introduced that basically cleaned up last year's bill that passed to weaken some of the lawsuits that were filed in response to last year's bill becoming law. So there were no major attempts to restrict access to women's health this year. There was also, following an occurrence at a Shawnee Mission Middle School that involved a sex ed poster. There was a lot of to-do in our local media and our local papers about this poster. Then what we saw in the legislature, this was just before the legislative session started, what we saw in the legislature was this strong push to address this sex ed poster that was that some parents disagreed with. We had an attempt to make all sex ed in the state opt in. What was interesting to a lot of legislators, that initially sounded like, what's the big deal? But when you pan out and you look at children's access to health information at home or in the communities, it's very limited. And so in an interest of public health, we want children to have access to information, good information about their sexuality. And so Planned Parenthood organized. There was a large group of university students that organized to educate legislators about what this would mean. And we saw a quick shift in how the legislators started to think about this attempt to require opt-in for sex ed across the state. And that ultimately was defeated. To accompany that, the same group that was pushing the opt-in mandate, they also were looking to change a couple of things. In Kansas, you can petition a citizen grand jury to investigate alleged violations of Kansas law. So you just go around and you collect a certain number of signatures, you turn it in, and if all your signatures are certified, then the county attorney has to convene a grand jury to commit or to investigate whatever crime you allege has been committed. We saw this used against Dr. Tiller in Wichita, and successfully. We saw this used twice in Johnson County. Most recently was a bare-breasted statue in the Johnson County Arboretum, and also against Planned Parenthood. So what we saw, the same groups that initiated those grand jury petitions and also were pushing for the opt-in mandate, they were looking to tweak the law about promoting materials harmful to minors. And what they were trying to do was to tweak that law so that you could bring it against a teacher for allegedly promoting material harmful to minors if they were to post a sex ed poster like what we saw in the Hawker Grove Middle School. That came out of the Senate committee and fortunately never made it up for debate in the Senate. The ACLU and the KNEA worked very quickly to try to bring that bill to a halt, and it successfully went nowhere. The final one is, and one of the most exciting ones, was the multiple defeats to the attempts to repeal the renewable energy portfolio. Am I saying that right? Renewable portfolio standards, renewable energy portfolio standards. There was this large coalition effort to repeal our RPS standards. And we saw lots of green shirts in the Capitol, and those were the Americans for Prosperity shirts. And they said I, and it was a torch, and then I think it said Kansas under it. And they were really pushing to repeal this. And it was really no secret that the Koch brothers were behind the repeal of the RPS. And it was just constantly sitting on the edge of your seat to see what was going to happen and how it was going to play out on the floor in each chamber. And to see it go down in flames in the House was very gratifying. It made you very proud of a lot of our Johnson County elected officials and elected officials from the western half of the state to really go to bat for those RPS standards. I don't think that issue is going to go away. They were talking about it pretty much up until the time that they gavelled out and went home. But it was defeated for this year, and so kudos to that. Just to briefly run through those that I would categorize as losses for those that share the MainStream values. School funding, it was sort of a mixed bag, but I think it was probably more of a loss than it was a win. One of the things that came out of that school funding bill that came right at the last minute without any sort of vetting through the legislative process was one that you might have heard a lot about, getting rid of or eliminating teachers' due process. So if a teacher's fired, no longer do they have an administrative hearing as a recourse. We saw also accompanying that tax credits for corporations who give donations for private school scholarships, parochial and secular private schools. We also saw some legislation pass that limits voter choice. It restricts it basically restricts when you can choose what party you want to affiliate with before an election. And so no longer can you wait for the filing deadline and see who has filed for election in your district. You'll need to make that decision before the filing deadline or register as an unaffiliated voter. We also saw another great loss in terms of Second Amendment legislation. Last year, we saw a bill that was designed to invalidate federal gun regulations in Kansas. To accompany that bill this year, we saw legislation that basically eliminates local control over firearms in counties and cities. We also saw the healthcare compact pass, and basically that takes Kansas out of Obamacare, and that passed with some debate, but I think it was a huge disappointment to all. We saw a strong avoidance of Medicaid expansion. In fact, they passed legislation that now requires legislative approval for the governor to say the governor wants to expand Medicaid. And then I'm not sure if this is just sort of an interesting tidbit I will leave you with, because it's all we heard about for the most part in the Capitol was about the lesser prairie chicken. We had lots of talk about the lesser prairie chicken. There are 2 display cases of prairie chickens next to the governor's office on the 2nd floor in the Capitol. But that basically also goes under that fight to invalidate federal, regulatory authority in Kansas. So what's the impact going forward? I think, one of the things that we need to take in consideration and pay attention to is the state budget, and couple that with the state tax policies. The budget bill this year, I think, passed the House 70-54, the Senate 22-18, I believe. I don't have it in my notes. And our state budget bill was $14.6 billion. And when you couple that budget bill and the cuts that are included in that with our state tax policies that have resulted in significantly less state revenues, it's only escalating the state financial crises that we are facing. We just received our 2nd downgrade by Moody's, and looking back at the state revenues for April, they were $92 million less than what was estimated. I believe that was $480 million less than what we had taken in this time last year. And we saw this sudden shift into it being a federal government problem. I would encourage people to do their homework before taking that talking point to heart. But basically, what we should take with us looking into 2015 is we have to do more than vote. We've got to be informed, we've got to be engaged, and we've got to be involved. We have to share our concerns with our neighbors and encourage them to register, to vote, and to also be engaged and involved.
I'd like to now introduce our panel of academics here in front of you. Dr. Bob Beatty received his PhD in political science from Arizona State University, and he's a professor of political science at Washburn University. He's the producer of the award-winning 2005 documentary, The Kansas Governor, and is the interviewer and editor of the Kansas History Journal. He has also published articles on Kansas campaigns in the journal Campaigns and Elections, serves as a political analyst for KSNT-TV in Topeka, writes a column for the Topeka Capital Journal, and that can't compare to his regular appearances on Up to Date with Steve Kraske. Sorry, I just had to say that. Dr. Beatty has hosted over a dozen election debates in the past decade that have aired statewide in Kansas and on C-SPAN, and he has lectured for the U.S. State Department on American politics in Mongolia, Russia, China, Hong Kong, and Paraguay. His most recent speaking engagement was at the Godzilla and Friends Film Festival in Topeka. Dr. Burdett Loomis is a professor of political science at the University of Kansas. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin and has been teaching at KU for 35 years. He has also served as an APSA Congressional Fellow, a visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution, the Director of Administrative Communications for Governors Kathleen Sebelius, and as the Interim Director of the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics. He also directs the KU Political Science Intern Program in Washington, D.C. and Topeka. Dr. Mark Peterson teaches American politics, public policy, and public administration. I'm seeing something here about public. A late-in-life immigrant to the Academy, Dr. Peterson earned his PhD at the University of New Mexico in 1996 and has taught in Topeka since 1998. His views are his own and in no way represent the position of the nameless institution in which he engages. His minimal talents as a member of the faculty and part-time pettifogging academic bureaucrat. Dr. Michael Smith is an associate professor of political science at Emporia State University. His current research involves voter-approved term limits and their impact on state legislatures, media coverage of candidates who die during election campaigns, research and political, research and political theory and political implications of the biblical letters of Paul. In his other life, he runs political campaigns for state representative candidates in Missouri and Kansas. This summer, an article on teaching civic engagement that he co-authored with former U.S. Senator and Florida Governor Bob Graham is forthcoming in the journal PS, Political Science and Politics. If you want more, look for his column from this week's Wichita Eagle titled Kansas to the Creative Class, Get Out and Stay Out. Let me tag on to something that Molly was mentioning just at the very end of her remarks. Bit of note of concern, state revenues, they have been plummeting, 45% from a year ago. State's revenue from the year is 93 million less than projected. And most of this, if not all, can be placed at the foot of big tax cuts lawmakers adopted. Bob Beatty, let's start with you. How concerned should taxpayers be?
Well, the model is that you cut taxes. This will bring about an energy among businesses and people who want to be in Kansas. And so many of them will get excited that the money lost on taxes will be more than made up for by all this economic activity. I think I'm quickly going to hand it over to Michael, because for those who haven't read his column, I think this ties into the column, which is the idea that essentially, and I've said this at some other forums, there's more to life than taxes. And I hope there is, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. But what that means, and more seriously, is the counter-argument to that is that there's so many other things that go into economic activity or people wanting to live in a state. Again, I'll let you talk about that. But in terms of Kansas taxpayers, even if the revenue falls continue, there is a very strong commitment from, as you mentioned, the legislature, from the governor, to continue to cut taxes. The goal is, and for many types of taxes, zero. The glide path to zero, of course, was talked about for several years. Now, you may say, well, if we don't have any money, how can we cut taxes? You cut services. You cut other things. And one of the, at least it was talked about, it didn't happen this session, for example, was cut all funding to public radio and public television. It was discussed. And in this session, it's like, oh, we don't need to do that. But next year or year after, if these tax cuts aren't bringing in enough money, the legislature would be able to say, we have no choice. We're not going to raise taxes, right? Only Bill Graves and Kathleen Sebelius and Mark Parkinson raise taxes. But we're not going to raise taxes, and that sounds funny, but the ideology of many of these legislators and the governor, I just can't see them raising taxes. So the alternative is, the answer to your question is cut services. Cut services is always going to be preferable to raising taxes. And if those people I just mentioned were all here on the panel, I don't think they wouldn't disagree. They'd say that's right. We need to make government leaner and cut services. But if you don't mind, can I pass it to Michael, because I think it ties into what about the Kansas taxpayer and this idea of there's so much invested in taxes, but you wrote about there's other things.
Bob's right. There is a tax that will go up. Don't want to tell anyone how to do their job, but if I were in the employ of the Davis campaign, for example, I just might mention this. We're seeing the school funding, base funding formula cut. A lot of school districts, like this one, Shawnee Mission, don't want to cut education funding. And we're also seeing a lot of tampering with what's called the local option budget, which gets really complex. But here's the bottom line: property taxes are going up. It's a domino effect of sorts. That is one tax that will, I think, go up significantly, with property taxes. There have been some support programs for small town development that have been cut as well. They may bring in property taxes to fund those, but the 500-pound gorilla is, of course, going to be schools. So I would say there is one tax that's going to go up significantly, and it's a complex tax. But what Bob was talking about in my snarkily titled editorial that I wrote this week, that there's this idea, and it's been overhyped, because when academics actually get people to listen to us, we get all excited, and sometimes we go over the top. But there's this concept that was developed in the late 90s called the creative class. It essentially argues that young, highly educated workers whose skills are very sought out, people in the so-called STEM, science, technology type fields, those with graduate degrees, those that are really sought out, those that will one day invent things that get patented and so on and so forth. They have choices in terms of what jobs they receive. And their choices, the research seems to indicate they don't really look that much at tax rates in terms of those choices. They look at living where they want to live, places where they feel welcome, places where they're wanted. So hence the cachet of communities like Austin, Texas, Portland, Oregon, the two cities of the keep us weird bumper stickers. Austin does benefit from Texas's low tax rates, but they also have higher local taxes than a lot of other communities in Texas. Oregon doesn't have particularly low tax rates. But people want to live there. They don't necessarily care what the tax rates are. And then the businesses will locate there because they want to hire the employees that want to live in those communities. There was a KPR story a few years ago about the community of Minneapolis, Kansas, little small-town Kansas community, and there was a manufacturer there that had taken tax cuts and reinvested them in the business, just like the theory holds, with tax cuts, a job creator. And in this case, he needed high-skilled blue-collar workers to work at this family-owned business. He couldn't find them. Unfortunately, the people he needed, some of whom had grown up in that community or similar communities, didn't want to live in Minneapolis, Kansas. They were moving here to Johnson County, or they were moving to Texas, or they were moving to other states, places which they saw as good places for young single people to live. And Minneapolis, Kansas wasn't on that list. One of the arguments is that that these highly educated college and graduate school grads are very sensitive to issues like GLBT rights. Even those that are heterosexual, it almost becomes a proxy for tolerance, a proxy for being open and affirming. Where do you stand on GLBT rights? I may not be gay, but some of my closest friends are. Where do you stand on this issue? It symbolizes a lot. Education funding is critical. Again, it symbolizes a lot, but also we're talking about people that may start families one of these days. They're looking, what's the climate for the schools? Universities are major hubs. I tease Bert a lot because I'm a University of Missouri graduate and I teach at Emporia State, but the truth of the matter is, when it comes to creative class hubs in Kansas, it's Lawrence. And clearly it's Lawrence. And that's because of the presence of the university there. So when you get things like the Board of Regents cracking down on free speech among, us. Talk about academics that are active on social media, here we are. Overriding tenure protections and so on and so forth. That may hurt the community's economy much more than taxes. State taxes are never, in most states, even close to as much as someone would pay in federal taxes. Generally speaking, unless you throw in that local property tax, which is actually going to go up. State taxes aren't that big a chunk of the picture when you look at property taxes and when you look at federal taxes and withholding taxes. But things like, what message are you sending on schools? What message are you sending about your support for universities, which may tie into the private sector with research? What message are you sending about being open and welcoming to the so-called creative class, people that, to use a horribly overused cliche, think outside the box, may damage the state's economy more than any benefit we see from tax cuts. Bert, Mark?
Let's stick with this topic that you just brought up a moment ago about the Board of Regents and approval to these new policies on what university employees may say on social media. So Bert, if you could, Burdette Loomis, if you could give us your take on that in more than 140 characters, and please do it vocally, and we promise we won't write it down.
Okay. My colleague, parentheses, my colleague Jim Guth tweeted about after one more mass shooting, you lose track, which one, a very intemperate remark about how the next time perhaps children of NRA members would be the ones who were killed. Stupid remark, stupid tweet. He probably, I think he has said, he would take it back. So immediately, the Board of Regents jumped into the fray. And I would say that there were 3 people on the Board of Regents who were pretty sophisticated, or at least I thought they were. Political folks. Fred Logan, former state chair, one of your neighbors. Kenny Wilk, former state legislator, and Eddie McKechnie, former state legislator. I've never gotten a very good understanding of why the regents, in this instance, decided to take the bull by the horns and create this policy that Fred Logan says is just it's no different from the current policy except a few tweaks here and there. Everyone else who's looked at it, scholars, law professors, say that it is an unbelievable abrogation of speech rights, and it allegedly overrides tenure. Now, if they tried to fire Jim Guth or me, for example, for the columns I write or the Facebook postings that I make, because it's not in the best interest of the university. That's what it says. Not in the best interest of the university. Well, figure that out. So if they wanted to do that, to fire either Guth or me, they would make either one of us a very rich man, without any question. But it goes right back.
That's not in the best interest of the university.
No. I'm not lobbying for that. But it goes right back to what Michael has said, that we're trying to hire 12 foundation professors. We've hired, I think, 2 or 3 of them. And we're trying to hire smart young PhDs. It's a great time to hire faculty members, a glut of really talented faculty members. So you have 2 or 3 offers. And you look and say, well, am I going to go, here or there? Am I going to go to Kansas? The Med Center, great place to go. The Cancer Center's booming. And then, you read about this, or you read about the loss of due process rights for teachers, or whatever. And Kansas has a lot of whatevers these days. And you say, what the heck? So, my own interpretation is that Fred Logan and Kenny Wilk and Eddie McKechnie, the political folks on that board, in part wanted to get ahead of the state legislature. And if you polled the state legislature, a majority would have wanted to fire Jim Guth. I don't think there's any question about that. So they wanted to get ahead of that. But what they did was act precipitously, and I think very foolishly. And Fred Logan, who I know reasonably well, he keeps getting farther and farther and farther out on this ledge that really has no support. And I think in terms of people in the university, we look at the Board of Regents. So one of the jobs of the Board of Regents is set policy and really give us a little buffer, individual universities, from the legislature, from the governor. And this Board of Regents isn't doing that. In fact, it's becoming embroiled in politics, and that's not a good thing.
Kind of a big win for open records. The legislature passed a bill that will make it easier to access probable cause affidavits. Channel 41 did a big series on this. And it's a victory for the Hart family from Leawood. Why was this so important? Who wants to tackle that one?
They're all looking at me.
You want to tackle it? Yeah. It's all yours.
You're the AC.
This was an interesting one. It ultimately got coupled with an attempt at the very end of session because so many legislators wanted this bill. It got coupled with a bill that not many legislators wanted to vote for because it had a lack of process in the policy making that goes on in the legislature, and that is a bill that would have, some say, rush the appeals for death penalty cases. And so it was interesting to see this issue get flushed out right at the very final days of session. But people were passionate about this bill dealing with open records I think because the story that brought awareness to this issue was so compelling. I'm sure a number of you saw on the local news what happened to this family. They were growing tomatoes in their basement, and they basically got raided. And then they had no explanation or no access to information as to why they were raided. Law enforcement was looking for drugs. They spent a long time looking for drugs in the home to no avail. And they, I think, made at least 3 trips to the legislature to share their story. And every single time it was compelling because I think people, especially the legislators, could see themselves in that couple's shoes. But to just go outside of that question for 1 second, we saw, I think, a huge loss to transparency and open government. And that deals with the Transparency Act. And Representative Clayton here locally was a strong advocate of this legislation. And basically that would have given us all access to the policy-making process in the Capitol. They would have put cameras inside committee rooms. Right now, all you can do is listen to audio of what's happening on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. Unless you actually go to the Capitol yourself, you do not hear what goes on in the committee rooms. And that is where a lot of the meat or the sausage is made. And there was a really strong push for it in both chambers, and it didn't make it out in the end. I hope that it lays the groundwork for stronger transparency, more open government in the future. But at least we got one win with the affidavits and the warrants, and maybe we've laid the groundwork for another win here in the future with the Transparency Act.
Another kind of big change this year. Lawmakers passed a bill canceling some local gun restrictions. Does this seem to run counter to the GOP principle of local control?
Although I think what the legislature did was foolish, I'm going to rise on a point of order, I guess you'd say. The notion of local control in municipal and county government is a fiction. We have a federalist system where there are constitutionally 2 sovereigns, the national government and then the state governments. But dating back to the late part of the 19th century and a legal principle called Dillon's Rule, it has been established dicta in the law that municipalities, schools, any political subdivision of a state is essentially a creature of the state's constitution and its statutes. So even in situations where municipalities have been given home rule, that home rule is a Lord giveth, Lord taketh away proposition. And so while it is amusing to suggest that Republicans would like to have their cake and eat it too, it doesn't actually work that way. And so our legislature is perfectly capable of doing what they've done. Now, the question of creating remembering that these opinions are my own and not those of the institution for which I work, the notion that a small group of fairly dedicated conservatives and libertarians can determine what's a good idea for Clay Center or Garden City or Pratt, Kansas, with one sweeping edict, is a little on the far end of the sanity spectrum. And it would be nice if we had Doc and Festus and the sign up in the Long Branch that says "Park your guns here," and seemingly we don't now. So yeah, I just had to take a moment to reflect on something that Kelly said, which I think I'm going to capture and figure out how to use many times. One could wish that law had successfully gone nowhere. It's sort of an interesting notion. If we could just get more things to successfully go nowhere, we'd be probably better off.
In terms of the electoral consequences, the question is interesting in this way, in that when Governor Brownback was asked about the loss of due process, the law that made that, got rid of that, he was quoted as saying, "I think that's best left at the local level." And that's a direct quote. So, that's up to the Paul Davis campaign and whoever else. They're going to have to, if they don't have to, but they may want to figure out how to. They're still thinking right now because they're trying to figure this out. But basically, to answer your question, guns are not. The ability to carry guns anywhere is not something we can leave, Mark, to the people of Clay Center, Pratt. I mean, they may take those rights away. But the due process of teachers, if they want to take that away in Pratt, that's their decision. So it's a difference in how they view those issues.
I think it's interesting. I look a lot at both Kansas and Missouri. And of course, in Missouri, the Republicans became the majority in the General Assembly more than 10 years ago. And when they first came into office, they had all kinds of wacky ideas and so on and so forth. But on many issues, I think there's been sort of a maturing. Now, that's not to say that every individual in the Missouri General Assembly is mature. I could mention some names, but I won't. But there's been sort of a maturing. Like the tax cut they passed this session, for example, which was much smaller than the Kansas tax cut, but it also had a trigger that there had to be a certain amount of revenue growth just to trigger the tax cut. We don't see that in the tax cut that passed Kansas previously. We don't see that kind of carefulness with a trigger and so on and so forth, or how they're dealing with public school issues, starting to nip at the edges of the charter schools issue and possibly vouchers, but only in Kansas City and St. Louis and a few other communities, versus this sweeping, just flat out repealing teacher tenure in a bill that was decided upon in just a few days of late night arguing in Kansas. So it may be that what we see in Missouri is what we'll get when there's been this sort of maturing of the conservative coalition in Kansas, except that Missouri's anti-gun control laws are, if anything, a good deal wackier than the ones in Kansas. Laws that state officials can be arrested for enforcing federal gun control laws, or that a local law enforcement official can be personally sued for enforcing federal gun control laws. They tried to force the cities of Kansas City and St. Louis to repeal ordinances that you can't carry a gun while drunk, and the cities refused to do that. They had this big press conference. And so what I'm saying here is that there's something about guns. There's something about guns that even as conservatives kind of mature and start to say, public policy is a little bit more complex than just ending teacher tenure and cutting taxes. There's more nuance. They're still conservative, of course. Those are their values, and probably the values of the people that elected them, honestly. But there's this sort of maturing. We're going to put an economic growth trigger into this tax cut. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to limit our school reforms to certain high-need school districts, not the whole state. They still are just way out there on guns. And I think it's just such a powerful symbolic issue for so many people that if your bona fides are that you are 110% NRA, you can get away with some other things. So I'm not sure that there will be a moderating of the push for anti-gun control laws in Kansas. I think, if anything, that's something they'll hang on to say, see, I'm a real populist conservative. See, look at this. I voted to have open carry statewide or what have you, even as they have to become, I hope, this isn't wood, but I'll knock on it anyway, a little bit more sophisticated in terms of policy making in other areas like taxes and schools.
Okay, I know you've got more questions, but let me try to make tie a couple things together in a general point here. And that is, first of all, I want to rescue the term conservative. These people are not conservative. And I know we use that as a shorthand. But I've really tried to stop using it. I'll either say right wing or Tea Party right or something like that. But these are not conservative in any meaningful sense of the word. I know what conservative. In Kansas, we've had moderate conservative governance for the last 40 or 50 years. Sort of a broad consensus, a little to the right of center. And we've had our fights and everything. But that's conservative. The second thing is, I think that when we start making comparisons and the Missouri legislature looks good, we should be really wary. But Michael's point, Michael's take on tax laws is dead on. They did take their time. The two major pieces of policy here in Kansas, the 2012 tax cuts and the teacher tenure, both of those were forced through the Senate and more or less pushed upon Brownback. Now he signed both of them, and he signed them willingly. He got his big tax cut. It wasn't quite what he wanted, I don't think. I'm not sure he would have rather signed a clean bill and not signed the teacher tenure. He saw that was going to create nothing but problems for him, and it's true. But you've got a lot of legislators in Kansas who simply, on a couple of dimensions, number one, caring about process. They don't. They don't care about process. Secondly, not only do they not care about process, they do not care about government. This really goes back to Bob's thing. We're going to cut and cut. So what? We'll find, and you'll find rationales. You can go listen to Greg Smith, and he'll give you a rationale for how much waste there is in Kansas government, and how much we're really spending on schools. Once you throw in everything, whether it gets to the classroom or not is another matter. But honestly, they don't much believe that government will ever work, and that you do want to put it in the bathtub and drown it. So we're really not talking about the sort of moderate left and certainly moderate conservative arguments we've had over the last 40 or 50 years. We're really talking about a bunch of people who have gone far to the right, and then on another dimension, not caring about government. We ought to have a good argument about how much government we should have. But when you have that government, you need to make it work. And honestly, I think a lot of people in the legislature have no commitment to making government work.
This week, IKEA announced that I would love to if I had more than one hand.
You didn't tell us this was going to be.
I'm not going to ask you how to put together the Urgen shelves or anything like that. This week, IKEA announced that they will install the largest rooftop solar collection array in the state of Kansas. This year, wind power was a big winner. Some lawmakers have tried to reject renewable energy standards, whereas others, including Governor Brownback, have supported them. Explain the dichotomy. Why is there growing resistance to these standards from some lawmakers?
You had it at the beginning. I mean, this was the Koch's #1 agenda item, not just in Kansas. In fact, they just got them reversed in Ohio, I think, yesterday. So this is again a nationwide campaign. And as I understand it, they're very upset that they did not get it done in Kansas. But I don't think you have to go farther than it was on the Koch's and an American for Prosperity agenda. They pushed it very, very hard and almost got it done. I don't, and then you can go back. Why it's on the Koch's agenda? Well, I think they're in the fossil fuel business. But there's a thing going around Facebook these days about number of days of sunshine in Germany, and and it's cloudy in Germany, and the percentage of electricity that is produced by solar energy, and then you've got Kansas, sun, and percentage, or the United States as a whole. So I think that this was almost a pure power play, and it didn't succeed, but I think it's highly said, it's on the agenda for next year.
This is a quote from Governor Brownback when he was asked about if he would run for president in 2016. Burdette Loomis and I have gone a little bit back and forth. Originally, I remember we did a forum a few years ago, and he was sure that Brownback was going to run. And I think lately I've become much more sure, and you're a little more hesitant. I don't know. But I think Governor Brownback has what he needs to run for president in terms of issues. Even things like 2453, the quote religious freedom bill, it didn't pass, but he could go to Iowa and talk about that and say, well, in Kansas, we didn't get it passed, but it's something. And there's other bills that bills that didn't pass in Iowa. It makes you look like, well, you're up against the system, and you just weren't able to get it done. Others did pass. So if you look at a record he could talk about of bills that did pass and didn't pass, we're talking taking on the teachers union, taking on protecting religious freedom, cutting taxes, privatizing CanCare, getting control of those out of control judges and changing the judicial selection, rural opportunity zones, reinvigorating the West, anti-abortion laws, the guns, of course, no to the Affordable Health Care Act, and no to Medicaid expansion. Issue-wise, this is a great list for Iowa. I've studied Iowa for years. Rick Santorum won the Iowa caucus, so keep that in mind. Now, all of this is a lead-up to give you this quote, and it ties into what this question is. Quote, so for 2016, Governor Brownback said, quote, my focus is to create a red state model that allows the Republican ticket to say, quote, see, we've got a different way and it works. And the key to that is, to your question, is, and we see it in Kansas, is if there's something that seems to be gaining momentum in the popular culture in America, and you mentioned, GLBT issues, if it's from Hollywood, or if it seems to be coming from the government. We talked about the lesser prairie chicken, this obscure. The reaction isn't, okay, how do we protect the lesser prairie chicken? It's the opposition to the government. We talked about gun laws. We're not going to allow federal officials to do this, that, the other. So my answer to your question is there is a natural opposition to something like renewable energy standards simply based on the fact that, think of this quote, we're not going to do what others tell us we should do. Even if it's, in fact, the fact that everyone out there, what I'm talking about is the rest of the country, the media, other states, the fact that they're telling us we should do it is a reason not to do it. I've confused myself a bit, but does that make sense? So, I mean, on a more serious note, if we see that in the quote-unquote Defense of Marriage Act, the snowball effect of gay marriage through elections in Washington and then the overturning of the Supreme Court, it's a snowball. It's absolutely incredible, actually. Is actually brought that to Kansas, because the more something becomes popular elsewhere, the more this quote, my focus is to create a model that allows the Republican ticket to see we've got a different way it works. We're not, and he said this in his State of the Union. I'll repeat it again. If the governor was here and other people, they would say, you're right, Bob. I've said it in my State of the Union. So there's some issues, and I think this is one of them, where the fact that all these other states have put them in, they're working on them, and it comes to Kansas is we don't trust it. Now the one issue that it doesn't is what are we calling it in Manhattan? This giant
NBAF.
MBAF.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That one is fine, right? Because it's defense. So
And you want to define
NBAF is studying
National Bioagricultural Defense.
Right. The federal government wants to set up a laboratory in Manhattan to study all the diseases that would kill us in 3 seconds in this room. Okay? That one, everybody's on board for. Bring it in. We want the money. Right? That's okay because it's defense. So defense and guns are golden. Okay? You take whatever you can get. But NBAF is building this building, federal money pouring in, and Medicaid expansion. Why don't you expand Medicaid? We don't trust whether the money will come in 5-6 years. It might dry up. Why? What about a defense budget cut? No. So the caveat is distrust of everything from the federal government, distrust of anything from the popular culture, except defense and guns. And if you got some other ones, we can put them on a list. But the lesser prairie chicken is a great example. These odd subjects become totems of a way to express this. We're not just going to let this group do this. Now, I'll say the reason this sparks my spider sense tingling is when you go to Iowa every 4 years, like madmen like myself do, and you travel with the candidates, which I do, Gingrich, Santorum, Romney, I'll name everyone, all of them. I spent days with them. Get in a coffee shop with 10 other people and a candidate, Republican candidate in Iowa, and that's what you hear. That's the message. What we're getting in Kansas is the message that sells to win the Iowa caucus. And to answer your question, though, it's not just Brownback, it's the entire legislature. They all could go to Iowa and run for president.
Let's talk a little bit about this small subject of Medicaid expansion. It didn't get very far this year. Will it have a better chance next year? Because lawmakers will have a better chance to see how the program is faring in other states, or not a chance?
I would like to go with option B. Actually, I wouldn't like to go with option B, but I suspect that's the correct answer. I don't see it going anywhere. This is a good example of that kind of what I'm calling a maturing that we see with what have become known as conservative Republicans. I think Bert's got a good point about the history of that word, but what have become known as conservative Republicans. And even in the South, you still have some vestiges of the old school Dixiecrat Democrats, too. They're still around in some southern states. But you look at a state, pretty conservative state like Kentucky or Arkansas that has gone with Medicaid expansion. One of the things you see is the tremendous need, because those states are way at the top of the list in terms of percentage uninsured. So part of it, I think, is need driven. They almost can't say no. There's so much need in those states. The percentage of uninsured in Kansas, for now, is not nearly that bad. Kansas traditionally has actually done fairly well as far as percentage of uninsured. I don't know where we're going. And certainly in certain communities, Wyandotte County, certain poor rural areas like southeast Kansas is much higher. But overall, statewide, Kansas isn't too bad. But again, there's just in a conservative state like Arkansas or Kentucky, there is this sort of maturing, this sort of process that says, we're conservatives. By gosh, we love our guns and we love our country, and we think abortion is wrong and so forth. But we have to govern. We were elected to govern, and it may be a small government, but a small government is not a non-existent government. And when you have a state that has this just huge need for health care, just fundamental basics of health care, and the federal government is saying, here, take it, we can't afford to say no. And again, sorry, Bert, but it got more of a hearing in Missouri. It wasn't approved, but it was taken more seriously, but ultimately still rejected. I don't think that again, what have come to be called conservatives, whether they really fit that label or not, in Kansas are there yet. That sense that, hey, we're conservative, we think most of the economy should go through the private sector, we're not giving up our guns, etc. But we still have to govern. I don't think they're there yet. I don't think the Kansas legislature is there yet. And of course, we do have elections ensuing. An electoral tsunami could change that, but I'm not in a place where I'd feel comfortable predicting that right now.
Allow me to ask about the elephant in the room, and the donkey in the room, the governor's race coming up, and your thoughts on it. Bob, you've got some polling information. Bird, you've got some. Everybody here has some thoughts on this race, and we've got time here, so let's get to it.
I'll give the polls, and then I'll let these guys comment on them, and you guys can digest them. There's been a number of polls, some released by the campaigns, but in January, one poll had Brownback up 11, 42-31, a lot of undecideds. February, PPP, Public Policy Polling, did 2 polls in February and April that had Davis up by 2 in the first one and Davis up by 4 the second one. And then in April, Rasmussen, which traditionally had leaned Republican, it's hard to tell what they're up to now because Scott Rasmussen has left, had Brownback up by 7. So there's very little consistency. Some of the consistency I see is a few things, and then we'll let these gentlemen and young lady, if she'd like, comment on it. One is that everybody knows Brownback. In the polls that ask for, basically, do you know who he is? One, I don't remember which one, had 99%. That's incredible. I mean, 3% of those polled don't even know they live in Kansas. How can you get 99% who know the governor?
I just moved here from Missouri.
That's absolutely remarkable. The other another poll asked, and he was at 97. So that's consistent. The other is that people don't know who Paul Davis is. I mean, obviously some do, but not very many. For example, one of the PPP polls said, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion? And 60% said, I don't know. 60%, and that's a lot. Interestingly enough, on specifics, one of the polls asked, is Brownback's tax plan successful? Yes, 26%, no, 47%, not sure, 27%. Should Kansas expand Medicaid? Yes, 52%, no, 35%, not sure, 13%. There's a lot of food for thought there. Several of the polls, Brownback's approval rating has not been very high all through 2013 in the Survey USA polls. This one, I'm just going to say it, because it take me too long to think about what to say about it. But in the PPP poll, do you approve of the job performance of Barack Obama? 34%. Do you approve of the job performance of Sam Brownback? 33%. Believe me, those are 2 different groups. But it's still incredible. It's still incredible. Bird may talk about this. That's why there's a strange lull in the race. It's like before World War II, actually, the fighting started after Poland was invaded. The fake war. There's not a lot's been going on, and it could be both campaigns are really trying to figure out what's going on because these poll numbers are around. But it's clear, I think I'm going to ask them to comment on it, it's clear Davis is in the ballgame. There's no question about that. Even when he's down by 7, he's at, Brownback's only at 47% as an incumbent governor. So I'll ask who wants to comment first.
All right, let's go this way.
Go this way.
Well, I think a poll number is, interesting. Basically means that Davis is in the race. If you'd have told Paul Davis when he was contemplating running a year ago, although I think he decided to run a year ago, that he'd be basically even in the polls, would have raised $1 million in his first 5 months, and was getting national press as a possible upset winner, he'd be extraordinarily happy. One of the 2 guys who does the rankings of candidates, Stu Rothenberg, just moved Kansas from likely Republican to leans Republican. And these guys in Washington, you have to pry them with a jackhammer to get them off of seeing Kansas as purely red. The last poll I saw was Davis was about 65% ID. He still has to define himself. Brownback will certainly try to define himself. He'll be known as Kathleen Sebelius, Barack Obama, Davis, without any question. But that 99%, 97% name identification for Brownback is a real problem, because Sam Brownback, although he's trying, and there's a Wall Street Journal op-ed today when he gave it the sweetest version of how Kansas is doing and how well we're doing, that perfect red state. I didn't know we liberalized our marijuana laws yet. But I think that what you've got to think about is that this is a real race. It's very much a real race. Brownback has lots and lots of negatives, both generally, but also in particular groups. You talk to anyone in local government, they get the amount of problems that the state's causing them. So there'll be a lot of money spent. I think everyone assumes, the Kochs are going to come in and throw immense amounts of money in. They very well may. They probably will. But the key thing is whether Paul Davis has enough resources. And between the money he raises, between outside money coming in to actually find actual funds being spent on his behalf, and groups from around the country, like labor unions, funding, say, groundwork, which they're doing here, I think the conventional wisdom is that Davis needs $5 million. And it's very likely he'll have that. He'll never show up totally in his campaign chest, but he'll have around $5 million. You can run a big campaign with $5 million. So, I think that the key will be if moderate Republicans will seriously vote, not just vote for Davis, but give Davis money and work for him. And even some other Republicans who aren't so conservative, or aren't so moderate even, but may just see that this is not a competent government. So I think that Davis has lots of places to make inroads. It's still a very red state. It's redder than when Kathleen Sebelius won 10, 14 years, 12 years ago. But this is still a state that 4 years ago still had a Democratic governor. So, Brownback's got a record. This will be a referendum on Brownback. And I think Davis has, a very, very good chance to win.
There used to be, there's this political science theory called median voter theorem, or Duverger's law. Basically holds that the political parties will position themselves just to the left and just to the right of where the middle voter is. Sorry about that. So the idea is the political parties will try to be close to the middle voter, but still just far enough over to not lose their base. Kansas was doing a great job of illustrating that in the 90s, because you'd have this essentially a Republican state, and you'd get moderate Republicans nominated like Bill Graves and Bob Dole, and they'd crush their opponents and win easily. And then along would come a candidate that was perceived as, and in my opinion really was more extreme. Everybody remember Phil Klein, for example. And the elections would change. Klein just barely eked out his first victory, and then he was defeated by Paul Morrison the second time. And then, of course, you had Kathleen Sebelius's victory over a more conservative Republican opponent. And so Kansas was just doing a wonderful job of illustrating this sort of self-correction. We are moderate Republicans. We elect moderate Republicans. There's nobody in this state that ever could have touched, say, Bob Dole. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. But when the Republicans nominate these Phil Klein-type candidates, Vince Snowbarger-type candidates, they can be defeated by a Democrat. And then, of course, there's a key part of that coalition that then turns around and votes Republican in presidential elections. So it's a red state in presidential elections. And one of the things that, we bounce emails back and forth off of each other periodically is that we have really tried to figure out is what happened? What happened to that sort of self-corrective mechanism And I think, I know Bob and I have talked about it and emailed about it really, and come to the conclusion that a lot of it is just this immediate emotional reaction to the election of Barack Obama. We could, lay a spiel on you about the image that Obama's opponents paint of him versus who he really is and so forth, but we won't do that. Suffice it to say that whatever his intentions, whatever he's done well or poorly, his very presence is divisive. And his very presence is perceived, wrongly in my opinion, but is perceived as moving the Democratic Party way to the political left and outside of a space where Kansas moderates could seriously consider voting for a Democrat under any circumstances. Now again, I don't think that's based on policy. I think that's based on race and exotic foreign names and the way you're portrayed by your opponents and so on and so forth, but nevertheless that's the reality. And I think one of the things that will be tested in this race is the Obama factor still relevant, or now that it's been 6 years, has that kind of gotten old? And will that Sebelius coalition be able to restore itself or be restored or not? And I don't know the answer, but I'm excited to find out.
You want
Go.
I'm going to take a little different tack because I thought about this before I came over tonight, and I've written about it recently, and I think it sort of offers perhaps a fantastic but possible way to resolve this issue that we're talking about. If you look at Sam Brownback, he's got a rock solid low 40% of the electorate that will support him. And he's known, as Bob has pointed out, 99% name identification. That means he's got no upside on that number. This is Paul Davis's race to win if he can do it. Now, we can talk about $5 million and a credible campaign. We can talk about Davis creating an image and an impression with the people of Kansas. But one of the things that I think offers a real opportunity, and I lay it out to you tonight because in some respects it's sort of up to you to do something about this. It's the thoughtful moderates in Kansas that can make the difference. And that is this race, this campaign has not only got to address the question of whether or not you keep Sam Brownback. Imagine Paul Davis elected with the same ratios that exist in the legislature as they are now. That's 4 years of sheer hell for Paul Davis and Jill Docking, and probably something a little thicker than sheer for the rest of us. The other problem that we have is that the Kansas gubernatorial race is an off-year race. And Kansas, like most other states in the country, has good voter turnout in presidential years and a 20-25% drop in voter turnout in off years. So Sam Brownback was elected in a year when 45% of the eligibles voted. 2012 was 67% turnout. So one of the things that's got to happen is voters have got to be more mobilized for the 2014 election than they usually are in off-year elections. But the second thing is this has got to be, in my opinion, the women's campaign year. There are 650,000 women in the state of Kansas who are eligible by age, who are unlikely to vote in the 2014 election if, in fact, we have the same kind of turnout we traditionally have in off-year elections. And in that 650,000 are going to be the least well-educated, the poorest, the bulk of female head of household with dependent children families, 279,000 unmarried young women who don't have families but are typically like unmarried young males on the low end of the socioeconomic scale because their lives are just beginning, they're just starting their careers and so forth. The thing that prompted me was about 4 weeks ago, Lynn Jenkins was in Topeka celebrating a Woman of the Year award for a small business entrepreneur. And she made this incredibly social Darwinistic observation about how women don't need no government to help them with job discrimination, why they're all just as smart and capable as I am. They can just get up on their hind legs and they can take care of business. And my response in the piece that I wrote was, yeah, tell that to a 20-year-old with a GED, an 18-month-old kid, no man in the house, when she works the night shift at Walmart, and the boss says, you're off the clock, but I need you to straighten up the storeroom. It is incumbent upon us to come up with ways to carry the message. Keen Umbear, the Libertarian candidate for governor, came out with what I think ought to be probably it's nearly as good as successfully going nowhere. A distinction. We've been talking for a long time since a year or two ago about the 1%. Keene made the observation that in Kansas we have the 17% and the 83%. The 17% are the ones who no longer pay income tax in the state of Kansas because of the change in the Sub-S and partnership law, the pass-through law. And the 83% are the rest of us who do pay the income tax and have experienced somewhat less relief from the reduction in that income tax because of some amusing changes that have taken place in things like deductions that can be made to your income tax. So there are distinctions, there are clear differences. There's the Medicaid problem. There's the GLBT issue. There's school support, and face it, for a lot of poor families in Kansas, school is not just school. School is a social safety net for children as well. And we need to find a way to market that message and motivate people who have heretofore been disaffected. Now, my political science hat says, ain't gonna happen. People have been trying that for a long, long time. The unwashed masses are inert even when they have their self-interest at stake. See Tom Frank and What's the Matter with Kansas and a litany of other texts that can be pointed to. But I think the deal is gettable for Davis if we can find the way to motivate people to understand that their self-interest is deeply embedded in this election. And it's got to go deeper than just changing who's in the front office. It means getting rid of people who ask for your vote to represent you and then work consistently against your personal self-interest.
Questions?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for dropping the word IKEA. I'm a Maryland City Councilman, so I appreciate you. I only heard one person clapping, just me.
For the record, I'm very happy.
Thank you. My question is this. I appreciate the panel being here and Holly and the rest. And how effective are you going to be with this crowd compared to what we're going to be doing in Johnson County Move On? We're going to meet at Antioch Library at 9 o'clock on June 7th, and we're going to go out and knock on very infrequent voters' doors. And we're going to ask for their vote by giving them a mail-in ballot for the November election, the application. So let's compare what you're going to do here with these people and what we're going to be doing by knocking on doors. Which is more effective?
You are hands down.
Join us.
That's been one of the frustrations with the self-identified moderates in this state, including this group, and it's a great group, and we appreciate the invitation. We don't want you to revoke any future ones, but there has been this tendency to want to have coffee and sit down at forums like this one and talk to or hear from people that we pretty much agree with. Say what you will about the right side of the Republican Party, about the Kochs, about the Kansas Chamber, about some of the political consultants close to Governor Brownback. Say what you will about them. They know what they're doing and they do it well. They operate as a political party, even though they didn't start out as a party. They started out as a faction within a party, and then kind of took over that party. They've got the best voter history list. They do exactly the kind of activities you are talking about: knocking on doors, phone banking. How many of us have worked in political campaigns where you get volunteers that say, "I'll do anything you want except knock on doors or call people"? Oh, okay, thanks. So you'll do anything we want except the things that win elections. That's great. Thank you so much for volunteering. Real politics isn't always the fun stuff. You know, it isn't always the coffee and dessert. It isn't always the attaboys and the meeting with people you agree with. That the role of something like this might be for morale, to get people kind of energized, but it's the activities that you describe that win or lose elections. And I think, you know, there's also a women's group down in Wichita that's organizing. That is, I think, wanting to be sort of the Wichita counterpart to MainStream, which there hasn't been one until recently. So that's interesting. That's exactly right. The things that maybe aren't as much fun. I mean, you know, the primaries are in July. You want to go door to door in July? But that's what wins elections. Really good voter history lists are worth a mint. Who votes? What's their history? What do we know about them? Can we merge data sets? Who among these infrequent voters is a member of the NEA? Who's a member of the NRA? Who's a member of this? Who's a member of that? And those lists are so critical. And ultimately, it's one individual voter at a time. I have to say, we're here in a church. It's United Church of Christ. That's my own denomination. And that's an issue too, you know, because oftentimes the mainline and the liberal Christians will say, you know, politics doesn't belong in church. This is a spiritual experience. I don't want that. And I understand that argument. But at the same time, you know, there are boundaries there that can be respected, and the people on the right know this well. You know, they don't go up, I mean, maybe in some cases they do, but if they're being watched, they don't go up behind the pulpit and say, vote for Sam Brownback. They know that's illegal. You catch people one-on-one, your friends, your neighbors, in the social hour after church. Hey, are you voting in the primary elections? Oh, you're not? Do you know how important this election is? They love that phrase. Do you know how important this election is? Do you know what's at stake? Where boundaries can be respected, both legal and spiritual, and yet, you know, in a time of diminishing social capital, what's one of the only effective organizing community institutions left is churches. That's one of the only ones we got left that's not online. And if people aren't willing to talk to people, quote unquote, about how important the election is, you don't say vote for. You don't say vote for X candidate. You say, do you know how important this election is? If people are above that, so to speak, then they're also above engaging in the very kind of activities they'll need to engage in if they want to win elections.
Just piggyback real quick. I don't know if this is coming later, but absolutely knocking on doors, canvassing, phone banking is what it takes to engage those voters. And I would say a number of you have taken the first step tonight by being at this MainStream forum. Get on the MainStream email list, become a MainStream member, because MainStream fully intends to work this election and to do those very activities that have just been discussed here tonight.
And you had a question?
I'd like to know how you assess the mood and momentum of young people in the primary in general coming up.
I'll start, and then I think they're mobilizable, but I honestly don't see young people being particularly attuned at all right now, and I think that they're people that can be reached in a variety of ways, and you certainly have the parties doing that kind of stuff. But boy, you know, banking on young people is really hard. I mean, they move. You know, we know all the stuff about it. And so I do think that the one thing that's happened over the last two general elections, in 2008 and 2012, for Democrats at least, where they have had substantial edges from young people, is that, first of all, they voted in a couple of elections, and secondly, the Democrats have pretty good data on those folks. So a lot of it is a matter of putting the door knocking or social, a lot of it is really not it's virtual door knocking. It's social media. You're not going to knock on a door and get a 19-year-old, but you're certainly going to possibly get him or her on social media. So part of it is just learning the trade, and the amount of knowledge that's been gained on getting out the vote, using peer groups, et cetera, is really tremendous. So we have all this data about the fall off, and there's certainly going to be fall off without any question. But I do think that in Kansas, if you have this well-publicized gubernatorial race with a lot of ads and a lot of interest, that may well allow for a lot more mobilization. But you've got to do all the stuff.
I just briefly want to mention, it ties into young people, and Burdett wrote a column on this, is that, as freaks like us who watch Kansas politics, and every time I get it, I'm so strange that I got excited when Dennis Pyle challenged Milt Wolf to a poll. Wow, what a day, this is fun. I'm like, wait, my God. Okay, now I got off track. But we watch these things very carefully, and the teacher tenure issue. Some of us think that this is big. That not just the issue, there's so many issues out there, but for the first time, really, in many, many years, again, Bird wrote a column about this, there's protests. And it wasn't just, you wrote about Lawrence, but it wasn't just Lawrence. It was out west, in western Kansas. So I'm watching my little headlines like, wait, Garden City? People are heckling the governor? Wait a second. So this is a momentum thing. Now, whether that can keep up, for there was a period of time where everywhere the governor went, there was protesters. He was surprised. And he ducked out the back of a building. He was he didn't know how to handle this. This doesn't look good for him. And now, I guess what I'm saying is that sort of expression can convince voters who are, I guess we could say, easily swayed, that you know what, and that this is the most non-political science way of putting it, it's not cool to vote for Brownback this year. That my teachers and other people are saying, you know what, the government, they're not competent, they're not out for your best interests. And we're seeing on television, we're seeing it, and it's not just in Lawrence. We'll see if this continues, if Davis can capitalize this. And I know we're running out of time, but Bert, if you can do it in 40 seconds, tell them what you wrote that column on, what happened in Lawrence, if they didn't hear about it.
Well, very briefly, and this happened in other places as well, is that Brownback came, he was going to give this is the great part about it. He was coming to talk to Leadership Kansas, and he was coming to talk in the Lawrence Arts Center. And so, to demonstrate his firm grasp of leadership, his car pulled into the alley behind the Lawrence Arts Center, which I didn't even know that there's a back door. And I go there all the time. And he snuck in, talked to them about leadership, and then snuck out the back door. But the same thing happened, I think, in Hayes and a couple of other places, that he really avoided. And honestly, it was about 10 or 12, 15 teachers. It wasn't a mob. I honestly think that there's a sense that they feel like because they have an R behind their name, that they will win. And so that's why they have elections, I guess.
Right.
Oh, sure.
just really quickly about the mobilizing young people and everyone else. One thing about what you're about to embark on is that it has to be ruthlessly data-driven. It's kind of like Moneyball. Not everybody likes what Moneyball's done to baseball, but it does win. And of course, one of the major founders of that is now a respected political analyst, Nate Silver. And this is very similar. If our heart wants us to mobilize the young people because they're the future, but our data is showing that married women in their 40s are the most mobilizable, we have to go with the data. And that's another thing that people like, for example, the governor's right-hand man, Dave Kinzinger, are very good at. It is ruthlessly data-driven. There is certainly a role for talking good government. There's certainly a role for leading with our hearts. But when it comes to these mobilization issues, we're talking about low turnout elections. We're talking about numbers matter. And you have to go with what the data shows. Even if you wish, say, you could go to the college campuses, if your data is saying that's not where those mobilizable kind of marginal voters are, you got to go where they are. And you may find yourself in some funny places, thinking, I didn't know we'd be in this precinct, but the data said this is where we need to be. And that's how elections are won and lost.
Allow me to thank our fine panel up here. Dr. Michael Smith from Emporia State University, Mark Peterson from Wichita State. I'm sorry, Washburn. I just gave you a new appointment here.
Just from Topeka.
Brennan Loomis from KU, Holly Weatherford from ACLU of Kansas. And who did I miss? Bob. Oh yeah, this guy. Washburn University. He's at Washburn. A big round of applause for our entire panel.